They sat me by the gifts like I was hired help, and that was the moment I decided the Groom's $9.9 million deal would never close. The ballroom at the Breakers in Palm Beach glittered under crystal chandeliers, all gold light and polished marble, the kind of place where every fork is aligned and every smile is rehearsed, and I stood there in my navy silk dress, watching a 23-year-old event coordinator glance at her clipboard before pointing me toward a small round table tucked beside a mountain of silver-wrapped boxes. "This will be perfect for you, Ms. Brooks," she said brightly. "Perfect." A chair between the gift registry display and a folding tray stacked with congratulatory cards. I followed her without protest. I have learned that humiliation delivered softly is still humiliation, and the softer it is, the more deliberate. My younger sister Lydia floated past me in champagne satin, air-kissing donors and future in-laws, her laughter rising above the string quartet. She didn't look at me. Connor Hale, the groom-to-be, stood near the center of the room, one hand resting confidently in his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke about expansion, logistics corridors, projected quarterly growth. I recognized the tone. I used to use it myself in boardrooms from Miami to Chicago. "We're finalizing a $9.9 million acquisition next week," he told a circle of investors. "Game changer." A few of them nodded with admiration. One of them glanced at me, then at the gifts, then quickly away. I folded my hands in my lap and smiled. For 38 years, I built Brooks Freight and Storage from 2 rented trucks and a 1,200 square foot warehouse into a regional operation with contracts along the entire eastern seaboard. I negotiated port access in Savannah. I refinanced during the recession when other firms folded. I signed the personal guarantees that kept us alive. Connor's first business loan had my signature beneath his. He had sat at my kitchen table 3 years ago, nervous and ambitious, promising Lydia he would prove himself worthy. I believed in potential. I always have. Tonight, no one mentioned that history. Instead, a guest approached me holding a wrapped blender and asked, kindly, "Where should I put this?" I gestured to the pile beside me. "Right here is fine." I became efficient. Organized. Invisible. From my seat, I could hear Connor's voice rise above the music. "Helen's always been supportive," he said lightly at one point, as if I were a retired aunt who baked pies instead of a majority shareholder who still held 32% of the holding company underwriting his acquisition. Supportive. The word lingered. Lydia finally drifted over, her perfume familiar, her smile tight. "Isn't this lovely?" she asked, not waiting for my answer. "We just thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere quiet." Somewhere quiet. I looked at the main table set with monogrammed place cards, crystal water goblets, and a clear line of sight to the stage where toasts would be made. Then I looked at the ribbon boxes at my feet. I nodded. "It's perfect," I said. She seemed relieved. That was the interesting part. Relief. As if she had expected resistance. As if seating me beside the gifts had been a small risk calculated in advance. I watched Connor raise a glass. "To family," he declared. Applause followed. I clapped too, softly, the way one does when observing a performance rather than participating in it. My phone rested in my clutch, silent for now. Earlier that afternoon, I had reviewed the acquisition documents one more time. My endorsement letter was still attached. My name carried weight in certain circles, especially with the private equity group funding the deal. Without it, their confidence would cool quickly. I had not planned to reconsider. I came tonight prepared to celebrate my sister. But as another guest leaned toward me and whispered, "They've got you working hard over here," with a sympathetic smile, something settled into place inside me. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Clarity. I have spent a lifetime understanding leverage. It rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself in small seating charts, in casual introductions, in the space between who built the table and who is invited to sit at it. I adjusted the stack of envelopes beside me and listened as Connor began outlining projected revenue streams to men who had once asked for my opinion. No one asked for it tonight. That was fine. I do not require a microphone to be heard. I require timing. And timing, I have found, is far more powerful than applause. The music swelled as the first toast began, and I remained at my small post beside the gifts, watching reflections ripple across the ballroom mirrors while servers in white jackets floated past with trays of sparkling water and champagne. Connor stood beneath a cascade of soft lights, his arm lightly resting around Lydia's waist, his voice steady and confident as he thanked everyone for believing in his vision. I noticed the way he said the word vision, as if it were something he had carved alone out of thin air rather than something carefully introduced to him over quiet lunches and signed letters of endorsement. The investors laughed at his anecdotes. One of them, Martin Ellis from Clearwater Capital, checked his phone and nodded as if confirming numbers in real time. I recognized that nod. It meant the preliminary wire transfers were already in motion, pending final confirmation once the acquisition agreement was formally countersigned on Monday morning. Monday morning. Less than 72 hours away. I folded another envelope and placed it neatly atop the growing stack beside me. A young woman in a pale blue dress approached and asked whether there was a list for tracking gifts. I assured her that everything was being handled. I have always handled things. When Brooks Freight expanded from Florida into Georgia, it was I who tracked every invoice and shipment weight down to the last pound. When fuel prices spiked 12 years ago, it was I who renegotiated contracts and preserved our margins. Competence becomes invisible when it is consistent. That is the paradox. Lydia returned to the center of the room for photographs, her smile radiant, her posture angled perfectly toward the cameras. She did not introduce me to the photographer. Instead, I appeared in the background of a few frames, partially obscured by ribbon boxes and metallic wrapping paper. I studied the seating chart displayed near the entrance. My name had been printed in the smallest font, beneath a category labeled Extended Family. I traced it lightly with my finger, then let my hand fall. Across the room, Connor leaned closer to Martin Ellis, speaking in lower tones now. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I knew the structure of that conversation. Projected earnings before interest and taxes. Distribution routes along Interstate 95. Warehouse automation metrics. All numbers drawn from the operational reports my office compiled for him. My office. 32% of Hale Logistics Holdings remained under Brooks Family Trust, which I chaired. That detail did not appear on the glossy brochures stacked near the bar. A waiter paused near me and asked if I would like something to drink. I requested still water. Clear. Simple. Unremarkable. Like my presence tonight. Connor eventually approached with a performative warmth that felt rehearsed. Aunt Helen, everything running smoothly over here, he asked, gesturing toward the gifts with a playful grin. I met his eyes and nodded. Very smoothly. He seemed satisfied with that answer. He did not linger. I watched him move back toward the investors, watched how easily he occupied the space I once commanded in boardrooms overlooking Biscayne Bay. Pride flickered briefly in me, then steadied into something else. Not regret. Assessment. Lydia joined him again, whispering something that made him laugh. They clinked glasses. Applause followed another toast about new beginnings. I remained seated. Invisible is not the same as powerless. It is simply underestimated. As the evening wore on, the pile of gifts grew taller, casting a small shadow across my shoes. Guests began drifting toward the dance floor, leaving the investors clustered near the stage where financial ambition mingled comfortably with family celebration. I slipped my phone from my clutch and opened the draft email I had reviewed earlier that afternoon. The subject line read, Endorsement Clarification. It was addressed to the executive committee at Clearwater Capital and to our internal board counsel. I reread the final sentence slowly. Pending review of certain governance considerations, my endorsement is hereby withdrawn effective immediately. I did not press send. Not yet. Timing is not about speed. It is about precision. Connor raised his glass once more and declared that the future looked brighter than ever. I believed him. The future always looks bright before the lights adjust and reveal who truly controls the switch. The evening shifted subtly after the second round of toasts, the way tides change without announcement, and I felt it from my small table beside the gifts as clearly as I once felt market corrections before they reached the headlines. Connor had drawn a tighter circle now, the investors no longer mingling freely but leaning inward, their shoulders angled protectively toward spreadsheets glowing on a tablet screen. I recognized the posture of men reviewing projected margins and risk exposure while pretending to celebrate. Lydia laughed on cue, touching Connor's arm at appropriate intervals, her eyes scanning the room to ensure admiration remained steady. I sat still and watched patterns unfold. Years ago, when Brooks' Freight expanded into North Carolina, I learned that expansion does not fail because of bold vision. It fails because of overlooked leverage. Tonight, I was that leverage. A waiter replaced my water with a fresh glass. I thanked him. Across the ballroom, Martin Ellis adjusted his glasses and asked Connor a question that caused a brief tightening around Connor's jaw. I could not hear the words, but I could read the tension. Governance structure. Board oversight. Minority stakeholders. Terms that sound polite yet carry weight. Connor recovered quickly, gesturing with confidence, referencing advisory support and established endorsements. My endorsement. My name still sat on the documentation scheduled for final confirmation on Monday morning at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Clearwater Capital required not only financial backing but reputational assurance. I provided both. Provided. Past tense felt more accurate now. A woman in a coral dress approached me and said softly, "You must be proud." I studied her expression. Genuine. Curious. I considered my answer carefully. Pride is a layered emotion. It can exist alongside disappointment without canceling it. I have seen many beginnings, I replied. They are always instructive. She seemed uncertain what that meant and returned to the dance floor. The band shifted into a slower melody. Couples stepped closer together. Lydia and Connor moved toward the center, applause rising as they began their first dance. Cameras flashed. I observed how the investors relaxed momentarily, comforted by romance and spectacle. Celebration has a way of softening scrutiny. That is why timing matters. I glanced again at my phone. The draft email waited patiently, its language precise and restrained. No accusation. No emotion. Simply a clarification of position. In business, clarity is often mistaken for hostility when it disrupts expectation. I adjusted the shawl around my shoulders and rose slowly from my chair, not to approach the dance floor but to stand with a clearer view of the investor cluster near the stage. Connor spun Lydia gracefully, and laughter echoed against the high ceilings. Martin Ellis checked his watch. It was 8:42 in the evening. Markets would open in less than 12 hours. My mind calculated without effort. Withdrawal tonight would ripple by morning. Contracts do not collapse dramatically. They unravel quietly, clause by clause, when a foundational signature is removed. I thought of the small font beneath extended family on the seating chart. Extended. As if influence were measured by proximity rather than equity. Connor dipped Lydia gently, applause swelling again. He looked triumphant. I held no anger toward him. Ambition often blinds the ambitious to the hands that steady them. But blindness does not erase consequence. I reopened the email and reread the final line once more, ensuring the wording conveyed neither resentment nor apology. Precision. Always precision. The music reached its crescendo, and as the room erupted in cheers, I understood that this was the last uncomplicated moment of the evening. Not because of spectacle, but because of decision. I did not need a spotlight to alter the course of events. I needed only a steady hand and the willingness to withdraw it. The applause lingered a few seconds longer than necessary, as if everyone wanted to remain suspended in the illusion of certainty, and I stood there with my phone resting lightly in my palm, feeling neither rushed nor hesitant, only aware. Connor guided Lydia off the dance floor to more cheers, his expression glowing with the confidence of a man who believed momentum could not be interrupted. The investors resumed their formation near the stage, jackets straightened, smiles recalibrated. I returned quietly to my seat beside the gifts and sat down once more, smoothing the edge of the tablecloth as if it required my attention. For decades, I had learned to read rooms before rooms realized they were being read. This one was buoyant, congratulatory, convinced of its own narrative. Connor leaned toward Martin Ellis again, this time with greater ease, gesturing toward the architectural renderings displayed on a standing easel near the bar. Distribution hubs. Automated inventory systems. A projected 15% annual growth curve over the next 5 years. Ambition presented as inevitability. I listened to fragments of conversation drift across the ballroom. Solid backing. Strong governance. Trusted name. Trusted name. My name. I lowered my eyes to the glowing screen in my hand and opened the endorsement letter attached to the acquisition packet. There it was in clear language, dated 3 weeks earlier, affirming my confidence in Hale Logistics Holdings and its leadership. Confidence is a currency more volatile than capital. It appreciates quickly. It withdraws faster. I thought back to the afternoon Connor first brought me the proposal, spreadsheet spread across my dining room table in Coral Gables, his voice earnest, respectful. He had asked for my guidance then. He had called me essential. I had believed him because mentorship, when offered sincerely, deserves support. But tonight had clarified something subtle yet significant. Essential had become expendable. Not openly. Not rudely. Simply repositioned. I observed Lydia greeting another cluster of guests, her smile radiant and unwavering. She avoided glancing toward my corner of the room. Avoidance is rarely accidental. It is strategic. A server paused to clear a plate near me, hesitating before asking if the gifts should be transported to a separate storage area. Leave them, I replied gently. They are fine here. They were fine. I was fine. Composure is not the absence of feeling. It is the discipline of response. The band transitioned into an upbeat song, and laughter rose once more. Connor's phone vibrated briefly on the cocktail table beside him. He glanced at it, then tucked it away, unaware that in a few hours devices like that would light up with very different notifications. I reopened the draft email and added one final sentence, careful, neutral, unassailable. Given recent observations regarding governance positioning, I must reassess my participation to ensure alignment with fiduciary responsibility. Fiduciary responsibility. A phrase that carries weight in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. No accusation. No explanation. Just a boundary. I reviewed the recipient list again. Executive Committee at Clearwater Capital. Our internal legal counsel. 2 board members whose loyalty was measured not by celebration but by contract. I inhaled slowly, steady as I had been before signing million-dollar credit lines during volatile markets. The difference between impulsive action and strategic withdrawal is preparation. I had prepared my entire life. Across the room, Connor raised another toast, thanking Lydia for believing in him when others did not. The room responded warmly. I felt no resentment at that. Belief is admirable. But belief does not override structure. And structure, in this case, included me. I pressed send. The screen shifted to confirmation. Message delivered. There was no sound. No dramatic interruption. The band continued. Glasses clinked. The investors remained smiling. I placed my phone back into my clutch and folded my hands calmly in my lap. Withdrawal does not require spectacle. It requires authority. Within minutes, somewhere beyond the ballroom walls, servers began syncing new emails, notifications cascading quietly through networks and inboxes. Markets would open soon enough. For now, the music played on, and I sat beside the gifts, composed, knowing that the most significant shift of the evening had occurred without anyone noticing at all. The band shifted into a faster rhythm and the dance floor filled again, heels tapping against polished marble, laughter rising in bright waves that skimmed across the ceiling. Nothing in the room suggested that anything had changed. That is the nature of structural shifts. They begin quietly, long before the surface reacts. I remained seated for another few minutes, observing Connor's posture as he leaned confidently into conversations, unaware that confidence without confirmation is fragile. My phone vibrated once in my clutch. A subtle pulse. I did not rush to check it. Discipline is not only about action. It is about restraint. When I finally glanced down, I saw a reply from Clearwater Capital's executive assistant confirming receipt of my message and requesting clarification first thing in the morning. The wording was polite. Urgent beneath the politeness. That was expected. I closed the screen and lifted my eyes toward the investor circle. Martin Ellis was now reviewing his own phone, his brow tightening slightly, the smallest contraction around his mouth. He did not interrupt Connor. Not yet. But he no longer smiled with the same ease. Markets may open at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, but doubt begins the moment information arrives. Lydia approached me again, her expression warm but measured. "You have been so quiet tonight," she said lightly. I met her gaze without hesitation. "It is your evening," I replied. "I am simply observing." She nodded, though something in her posture shifted, as if she sensed an undercurrent she could not identify. She glanced briefly at the investors, then back at me. "Everything is still on track for Monday," she added, too casually. I allowed a small, thoughtful pause before answering. "Monday will bring clarity." The word clarity seemed to linger between us. She smiled again, thinner this time, then turned away to greet another guest. Across the room, Connor's laughter faltered for half a second as Martin leaned closer to him. Their conversation grew quieter. A tablet was repositioned. A finger traced along a column of numbers. Connor nodded firmly, speaking with assurance, yet his gestures became slightly more precise, less expansive. Precision often signals recalibration. I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the front of my dress. The pile of gifts beside me had grown high enough to cast a long shadow across the tablecloth. I placed the stack of envelopes neatly in a single row and stepped away from the corner where I had been seated all evening. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. Invisibility has its conveniences. As I moved toward the exit, I caught a final glimpse of the dance floor. Lydia was smiling for photographs. Connor's jaw was set more firmly now, his phone in his hand, screen lit. The first real notification had likely arrived. Not catastrophe. Not collapse. Inquiry. Inquiry is the beginning of scrutiny. And scrutiny changes everything. I paused briefly near the entrance, taking in the room one last time. The chandeliers still glowed. The music still played. The celebration continued uninterrupted. But momentum had shifted, imperceptibly, from certainty to assessment. I stepped outside into the warm Florida night air, the sound of the ocean faint beyond the terrace. My driver opened the car door without question. As I settled into the back seat, my phone vibrated again, this time with a message from internal counsel requesting an immediate call at 8 o'clock in the morning. I responded with a single word. Confirmed. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the ballroom lights behind. Withdrawal is rarely dramatic. It is deliberate. And by the time the music faded and the last guests departed, the foundation beneath Monday's celebration had already begun to adjust to the absence of my name. The Florida night air felt heavier once I returned home, not because of regret, but because decisions settle differently in silence than they do beneath chandeliers. My house in Coral Gables stood quiet and still, the lights from the street casting soft lines across the foyer marble. I placed my clutch on the console table and removed my heels, setting them neatly side by side. Order has always calmed me. I poured a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the dark outline of the palms swaying gently in the breeze. Somewhere across the city, the celebration was likely still winding down, laughter fading into goodbyes, photographs being uploaded, glasses being cleared. Momentum on the surface. Adjustment underneath. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a direct message from Martin Ellis. Brief. Professional. Helen, we received your note. Requesting discussion at 8:30 before market open. His tone carried no accusation, only concern sharpened. By timing. I responded that I would be available. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and allowed the quiet to settle. I have always believed that leadership reveals itself most clearly in moments when others are scrambling. I did not scramble. I reviewed the acquisition documents once more on my home office computer, confirming the clauses tied to my endorsement. The language was unambiguous. The transaction required my written affirmation to proceed under the current valuation terms. Without it, Clearwater Capital would be obligated to re-examine risk exposure and adjust their position accordingly. Adjustment is a polite word for hesitation. Hesitation is expensive. At 7:45 the next morning, I was seated at my desk with a cup of black coffee, sunlight filtering through the shutters in thin, deliberate lines. My call with internal counsel lasted 12 minutes. Calm. Focused. They confirmed receipt of my withdrawal and asked whether I intended to reinstate support if certain governance concerns were addressed. I answered truthfully. That would depend on whether alignment could be restored. Alignment. Another word that carries weight when spoken slowly. At 8:30, Martin joined the conference call along with two senior partners. Their voices were controlled but alert. They asked what had prompted my reassessment. I did not mention seating charts or small tables beside wrapped gifts. I referenced structural positioning, board visibility, and transparency of stakeholder communication. Facts, not feelings. Business responds to structure, not sentiment. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear recalculations taking place behind the silence. Connor joined the call at 8:42, his tone polished but tighter than the night before. He expressed surprise, suggested misunderstanding, emphasized his respect for my experience. Respect is easy to articulate when capital depends upon it. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I spoke evenly. Endorsement is not ceremonial, I said. It is structural. If structure shifts without acknowledgement, endorsement must be reconsidered. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Markets opened at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Within minutes, Clearwater Capital informed Connor that final confirmation of the $9.9 million acquisition would be delayed pending internal review. Delayed. Not cancelled. Not yet. But delay in leveraged transactions often triggers additional scrutiny from secondary partners. Secondary partners rarely enjoy uncertainty. By 9:15, two additional investors requested clarification from Connor's office. By 9:27, his assistant emailed my office asking if we could speak privately. I did not respond immediately. Timing, again. I finished my coffee, reviewed overnight freight reports from Savannah, and signed off on a routine contract renewal worth $400,000. Stability has its own quiet authority. At 10:05, I finally returned Connor's call. His voice no longer carried last night's effortless confidence. There was urgency now, carefully contained. He asked what had changed. I allowed a measured pause before answering. Positioning, I said. Nothing more. Nothing less. Outside my office window, the morning sun rose fully above the palms, bright and unwavering. Inside the financial district downtown, analysts were already updating projections. A single signature removed does not create chaos. It creates reconsideration. And reconsideration, when attached to $9.9 million, has a way of rewriting expectations before lunchtime. By 11:30 that morning, the tone of every incoming message had shifted from inquiry to containment. My office assistant stepped quietly into the doorway and informed me that 2 members of Hale Logistics Holdings had requested an emergency board call for noon. I thanked her and asked her to clear my schedule for the next hour. Calm is contagious when it is genuine. I reviewed the updated memorandum from Clearwater Capital confirming that the acquisition would remain suspended pending revised governance disclosures and endorsement clarification. Suspended. The word carried weight without drama. Connor called again at 11:45. I allowed it to ring twice before answering. His voice was controlled, but beneath the control lay strain sharpened by unfolding consequences. He explained that secondary investors were expressing concern and that press rumors about a potential delay could affect supplier confidence. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I asked a single question. Why was my role minimized in the board presentation materials? There was a pause. Not long, but measurable. He responded that the materials were streamlined for clarity. Streamlined. A convenient word for omission. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply repeated, why was my role minimized? Silence again. This time longer. Finally he admitted that the advisory language had been adjusted to position the company as fully independent moving forward. Independent. Another word that sounds impressive until independence requires capital. At noon, the board call began. Lydia joined from their downtown office, her tone sharper than it had been at the party. She asked directly whether I understood the financial implications of my decision. I assured her that I did. I outlined the structural requirement of endorsement under the existing valuation agreement and clarified that my withdrawal was not emotional but procedural. I explained that when governance positioning shifts without transparent discussion, fiduciary responsibility demands reassessment. The board members listened. One of them, a quiet man named Harold Benton, asked Connor whether alternative underwriting had been secured. Connor admitted that negotiations were preliminary. Preliminary financing in a leveraged acquisition is not security. It is optimism. By 12:20, Clearwater Capital formally requested revised documentation reflecting a clarified stakeholder structure before proceeding. That request effectively paused the transaction. Connor's breathing became audible through the speakerphone. Lydia attempted to redirect the conversation toward unity and family reputation. I responded evenly that unity is strengthened by acknowledgement, not by reduction. I reminded them that 32% equity remains substantive regardless of seating charts or presentation slides. No one referenced the party. No one needed to. The implications were now financial, measurable, immediate. After the call ended, my office remained quiet. Outside, traffic along Coral Way moved steadily, unaware that a $9.9 million expectation had shifted course. I signed 2 freight contracts and approved a maintenance upgrade at our Jacksonville facility. Stability again. At 1:15, Connor sent a brief email requesting an in-person meeting. I agreed to 3 o'clock. When he arrived that afternoon, his confidence was tempered, his posture less expansive than it had been beneath ballroom lights. He spoke carefully about timing, about investor perception, about future collaboration. I listened, hands folded on the desk that had witnessed decades of negotiations far more volatile than this one. When he finished, I said simply, respect is structural. He did not argue. He understood at last that endorsement is not decorative. It is foundational. And foundations, once questioned, do not quietly return without deliberate reconstruction. Connor remained seated across from my desk long after his prepared arguments had dissolved into silence. The late afternoon sun filtered through the shutters, casting narrow lines across the polished wood between us. He looked different without the glow of celebration around him. Ambition remains visible, but confidence shifts when it encounters resistance that does not yield. This delay could cost us months, he said. Carefully. Suppliers are already asking questions. I folded my hands and met his eyes without hostility. Suppliers respond to stability, I answered. Stability responds to transparency. He inhaled slowly, as if recalibrating. We did not intend to minimize you, he said. Intent is often cited when impact becomes inconvenient. I did not debate his intent. I focused on structure. Positioning communicates priority, I replied. If my equity is substantive in documents but negligible in presentation, that is misalignment. He nodded once, the acknowledgement reluctant but real. There was no anger in the room. Only consequence. After he left, Lydia called within minutes. Her tone carried frustration sharpened by fear of public perception. She spoke about timing, about how close they were to final approval, about how this shift could affect their reputation in Palm Beach and beyond. Reputation. I listened as she layered concern over urgency. When she paused, I responded evenly. Reputation is built on consistency, I said. If internal representation changes without dialogue, reputation adjusts accordingly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked whether I would reconsider if certain language were restored and governance clarified formally. That question mattered. It was the first acknowledgement that restoration required structural correction rather than emotional appeal. I told her I would review any revised proposal with care. Not because I felt pressured, but because I have always believed in rebuilding when rebuilding is done honestly. That evening, Clearwater Capital sent a formal memorandum outlining revised conditions for reconsideration. Additional board visibility. Public acknowledgement of equity structure. Explicit reference to my advisory authority within the acquisition framework. The language was precise. Necessary. Connor forwarded the memorandum to me with a brief message requesting collaboration rather than confrontation. Words matter. Collaboration suggests partnership. Confrontation implies opposition. I read the document twice, then closed my laptop and stepped onto the terrace. The air was warm, steady, unchanged by financial tremors. Across the bay, the city lights shimmered in quiet patterns, indifferent to transactions paused or resumed. I reflected on the previous 48 hours. A seating chart had revealed more than insult. It had revealed assumption. The assumption that visibility can be reduced without consequence. That legacy can be positioned as decorative rather than foundational. I have never objected to celebration. I object to erasure. The next morning, I met with internal counsel again and outlined the conditions under which my endorsement could be reinstated. Clear acknowledgement in investor communications. Revised governance slides reflecting accurate equity distribution. Direct board access during acquisition oversight. No theatrics. No apology demanded. Just correction. By midday, Connor confirmed that he would present the updated structure to Clearwater Capital before the close of business. His tone carried less resistance now and more recognition. Markets reward adaptability. They penalize denial. I did not experience satisfaction. Only steadiness. Authority exercised quietly does not require triumph. It requires alignment. As the week progressed, investor confidence stabilized, not because the deal was guaranteed, but because its foundation was clarified. Connor scheduled a follow-up meeting in my office, this time with full documentation and acknowledgement printed clearly on the first page. Lydia accompanied him, her posture measured, her voice composed. There were no references to the party, no mention of gift tables or seating arrangements. Those details had served their purpose. What remained was structure. And structure, once corrected, has a way of restoring balance without raising its voice. The revised documents arrived 3 days later, printed on heavy stock, the structure corrected in clean, unmistakable language. My equity percentage appeared clearly beneath the governance section, my advisory authority outlined without reduction, my endorsement positioned as foundational rather than ceremonial. Connor sat across from me once more, this time with measured composure instead of urgency. Lydia remained quiet beside him, her posture composed, her attention focused on the page rather than the room. There was no tension in the air now, only recalibration. I read each clause slowly, not because I doubted the wording, but because clarity deserves attention. When I finished, I placed the papers on my desk and looked at Connor. "Alignment restores momentum," I said. He nodded, the acknowledgement sincere this time. Clearwater Capital scheduled a follow-up call that afternoon. Their tone had shifted as well, no longer cautious, but reassured by structural transparency. Investor confidence does not return because someone demands it. It returns because uncertainty has been addressed without denial. By the end of the week, the acquisition was back on track under revised terms, not diminished, not inflated, simply accurate. The valuation held. The oversight expanded. The presentation materials reflected reality rather than convenience. I signed the updated endorsement letter without hesitation. Not because pressure had been applied, but because correction had been made. There is a difference. Connor thanked me formally, his voice steady, no longer layered with performance. Lydia met my eyes and held them, a quiet recognition passing between us that required no further explanation. The following month, the acquisition closed at $9.9 million, announced with measured optimism rather than spectacle. In the official press release, my role was acknowledged clearly as chair of the Brooks Family Trust and principal equity partner in Hale Logistics Holdings. It was a single paragraph, but it stood where it belonged. I did not attend the subsequent investor luncheon. I had no need to. My presence had already been established where it mattered. Instead, I spent that afternoon reviewing freight reports and approving an expansion proposal for our Jacksonville facility, a project valued at $420,000. Stability, again. Weeks later, Lydia invited me to dinner at her home. There was no orchestra, no crystal chandeliers, no curated seating chart. Just a dining table set for 4 and a conversation carried without performance. Connor spoke openly about lessons learned regarding presentation and partnership. Lydia apologized without dramatics, not for a chair beside a pile of gifts, but for the assumption behind it. I accepted without dwelling. Correction is more valuable than apology when it is demonstrated. As I drove home that evening, I considered how small moments reveal larger truths. A seat at a table. A name printed in smaller font. A presentation slide adjusted for convenience. None of those details alone collapse a structure. But together, they signal whether respect is ornamental or embedded. I do not require center stage to understand my position. Influence does not depend on proximity to celebration. It depends on acknowledgement of foundation. The acquisition moved forward. The company grew. Governance meetings became more balanced, voices more evenly weighted. And I remained where I have always been, not at the edge of the room, not beside wrapped boxes, but at the structural core where decisions are signed and sustained. Authority does not shout. It does not demand applause. It simply withdraws when minimized and returns when recognized. And once recognized properly, it does not need to be repositioned again.